Hi, I'd like to talk to you a little bit today about the effects that the Great Depression had on the American family. You've already read through the causes of the Great Depression, but I just want to remind you one of those was that uneven distribution of income. The rich were getting richer and the poor were getting poorer. More than 70% of the nation's families earned less than $2,500 a year, which was the minimum for a decent standard of living, according to economists at the time. I'd like for you to think about how many new outfits you buy a year. If I was thinking about this with work and social time, I probably, on average, will say buy 15 new outfits a year. I mean, this would be like a shirt that I could mix and match with other things, or skirts, or whatever. But enough clothing items to make at least 15 new items. And that's probably being conservative. I don't count that regularly, but I buy several new outfits a year, right? That's the point. Economists at the time estimated that the average person bought one new outfit a year before the Depression, right? So when we're talking about the Great Depression, one of the things that we have to understand is that these people started with nothing and lost everything. They were already, by most people's standards, quite poor, and then they lost it all. And so that is a major component of the Great Depression and why it's going to have such a huge effect on American families. So I've got a newspaper here. If you were alive during the Great Depression, what are some things that maybe you could use a newspaper for, beyond its just normal use of like reading the news? Brainstorm for a minute. I'll be silent for like 5 seconds. Were you thinking things like you could use it as a blanket of some sort in desperate times? I've had students brainstorm things like using it to paste on walls as kind of like an insulation of sorts, stuffing it in clothing to provide insulation of sorts, using it as scrap paper, wrapping paper, as a fuel source for fires. You could use it, if you were desperate, as toilet paper, for sanitary needs for women. All of those things, good guesses. My grandparents were alive during the Great Depression, and my grandma told me, let's see if I can show you this while I do it, that what they would do is they'd roll up newspaper like this, and then they'd take a string and they'd tie the string on one end. It's happening off camera. You can't see it. Sorry. I need some jazzy music while I'm doing this so that you don't get bored. Still tying. Still tying. Okay, so I've got string finally around one end, and guess what? String's gonna go around the other end. Oh, brother, you gotta sit here for this too. Tying the string. If I had an assistant that could have help me right now, it would be so much easier. They tie string around two edges. All right, so now I've got string on this end and I've got string on this end. I've got a baton of sorts. And then, because we're not done with the string, they take another piece and tie it around the middle of this baton. And what they're going to end up with is this. Okay, so any guesses what this might be used for? Well, they were so poor that at the time they would roll up newspaper like this and use it as a hanger. I don't know if you can like super see this. I've just like hung my jacket on this. Think about this. Wire hangers, which in general we kind of detest and just throw them away because they get in our way. They could not even afford wire hangers. And because necessity is the mother of invention, they would use newspaper and string to create hangers. And it's really pretty sturdy. And remember, they're only buying one new outfit a year. So probably Sunday's best goes on the newspaper hanger. And then last year's Sunday's best becomes what you would wear throughout the week, or it's a hand-me-down to a sibling. But yeah, they were poor. When we talk about what was happening in the Great Depression, they lost everything. It started with nothing. So besides having to become quite ingenuous with everyday items, there are going to be other effects on the American family as well. Family was a source of strength. They believed in traditional values and emphasized the importance of family unity. They would, of course, they couldn't afford to go out and do things, so they would stay home, play board games together, listen to the radio. But when we look at the American family, how it affected individual members of the family differed. So for starters, men, they're going to be affected differently because of the Great Depression than other people in their family. Many men had difficulty coping with unemployment. The reason for this is because they were accustomed to work. They were supposed to support their families. When we think about gender roles at the time, it was just expected that the man would be out and doing work, having a job to support his family. And because they could not do that, they couldn't find jobs, there were no jobs to be had, they would walk the streets in search of jobs, and men especially became really discouraged. Some men just stopped trying to find work. Some men abandoned their family. During the Great Depression, we know that somewhere up to 300,000 men became hobos, wandering the country. And this, of course, seems to us in the 2000s as awful. Why would you abandon your family? Well, from the man's perspective, if he left his family, there would be one less mouth to feed. He would be less of a burden, and since he couldn't provide, he felt like he was doing the best thing for his family. Women experienced the Great Depression differently. Women were forced to become quite resourceful. They canned their own food. They sewed their own clothes. They managed the household budgets. What is surprising, I think, to many people today is that many women were actually able to get jobs outside of the home. We have to ask ourselves, why would they be hired? Well, they make less money than men. So when businesses during the Great Depression were just trying to survive, one of the largest amounts of overhead that a business has is payroll. And if they can get workers that are going to cost them less, then their business may stay afloat. So women were frequently hired when men would not be. And because of that, they became targets of resentment. Many people believed that women, especially married women, had no right to work when there were unemployed men about. Children experienced the Great Depression differently. Quite sadly, children experienced a lot of health problems because of poor diet and the lack of money for health care. We saw a rise in malnutrition, and especially a disorder called rickets. Rickets is a disorder that's caused by a lack of vitamin D, calcium, or phosphate. And it leads to the softening and weakening of the bones. You can Google rickets and you'll see kids that have legs that are bowed out because their bones have become soft. Tax revenue was down during the Great Depression. This is not surprising, but we use taxes to fund what? Public schools, public education. And so school boards were forced to shorten the school year. Some schools closed altogether. By 1933, 2,600 schools had closed and 300,000 students were out of school. So that was some of the major effects that children experienced. In general, we also have to consider the social and psychological effects of the Great Depression on the American family. Some people were so demoralized by the Great Depression that they lost their will to survive. Suicide rates rose more than 30% between 1928 and 1932. I always want to be clear with the statistic. That means first of all, I'm making this number up. If the suicide rate was 10%, when it rose by 30%, that does not mean that 40% of the people were committing suicide. Increasing 10% by 30% makes the suicide rate 13%. And so, which is still an devastating increase in the number of people committing suicide. But those rates did raise quite a bit during the Depression. 3 times as many people were admitted to state mental hospitals as in normal times. And after the Depression was over, for many people, the stigma of the Depression and that level of poverty never left. You see a lot of people, older people especially, that were of the Depression era who would be considered maybe like a hoarder of certain objects. They don't want to throw away anything that might have value or could be used for some purpose because you just never know when you might need it. And so, again, the Great Depression, we see how it had different effects on men, women, and children, and then the overall social and psychological effect on the American family was pretty grave as well.